Hey guys, my name is Michaeli Christensen. This is the presentation for Understanding the Beat Generation by myself, Elizabeth Slavin, Austin Nelson, and Jara Estrada. So, without further ado, we're going to begin with Elizabeth talking about an overview of the Beat Generation.
Hi, my name is Elizabeth Slavin, and I'm going to be going over the overview of the Beat Generation. So this is the slide. The Beat Generation was a literary movement started by a group of authors whose works explored and influenced American culture and political in the post-war era. Most of their works were published in the 1950s and popularized in the 1950s. And the next slide is this picture. And we can see that in the 1950s, everything was very traditional and trying to go back to the traditional ways of America before the World War. And so these authors really wanted to combat the traditional ways and go in a more liberated views and ideals of the world and how we need to change and evolve with the world itself right now.
William S. Burroughs was an American novelist during the Beat Generation. He was the oldest of the main authors in the movement. He met the other authors in 1943 and was soon persuaded by Jack Kerouac to begin writing seriously again after a few previously failed attempts. Much of his work surrounds his own life and experiences in life, especially with topics like addiction, sexuality, and his past violence. His first novel, Junkie, is told from a semi-autobiographical viewpoint, and it discusses his struggle with heroin addiction. Consequently, Junkie was not met with critical acclaim, as that topic wasn't often touched on in literature. All of his books after this dealt with themes many authors, excluding the Beat authors, actively avoided. For example, in his book Queer, it discussed Burroughs' sexuality and his personal experiences. He also often wrote of places he traveled to, for example, like Tangiers or Mexico City. He was known for his love of these cities and their inspiration on him, and even helping him to experiment with his writing. He once noted that while living in Tangiers, he wrote Naked Lunch, while listening to the static of a radio playing in the background. This outlandish technique soon became Burroughs' best summary, as his writing often was viewed by critics as lacking a story or even messy at times. William S. Burroughs also used a technique very unique at the time, where he would take linear stories and cut them up and make the story less linear to give the reader a disoriented feeling while reading. This wasn't the only technique Burroughs used. He also used what many of the Beat authors used and called stream of consciousness. The style was used by him in all of his published works. In his story, Twilight's Last Gleamings, he uses humor and absurdity to highlight the main character's issues with addiction and selfishness. Much of Burroughs' work used this humor to highlight his points.
So I'm going to be talking about Allen Ginsberg. This is the slide, and this was him when he was younger. So Allen Ginsberg is credited as being one of the most influential poets of his time, and also he was credited as helping to create the Beat Generation overall. He was a great poet up until his death in 1977, and his most famous work was The Howl, and I have his book right here. And the poem is actually about 9 pages long, and it's broken down into 3 separate parts because when he went into making that poem, he didn't know he was going to create it. So he took on and adapted 2 separate additional parts to the original one. Allen Ginsberg's poem, The Howl, was a cry against repression and capitalism and is renowned as the start of the Beat Generation and is celebrated for starting the counterculture in America. When he was alive, his work wasn't really that celebrated besides everyone in the Beat Generation, but nobody of the public really wanted to read his works. And now that he is gone, people are celebrating his works for what they really are, masterpieces.
Diane DiPrima, I think it's very important that I start off by saying that she was Italian. She was an Italian woman, and she came from a very conservative family, a family that very much believed in the whole gender roles and, going through life with religion, but not her. She really shied away from all of that. Like I mentioned in the last slide, she really was open about having multiple intimate partners. It wasn't a big deal to her. It was just kind of her life. And she knew that she would get judged. She read things about herself, but that didn't stop her from really opening up the conversation to women wanting to be more than just a housewife. She was a part of a magazine company. She was an editor there. She was very well known for that. And then she just wanted more. She wanted to create her own thing. And I think this really shows her empowerment as a woman during this time because it was very rare that she would, or that any woman in general would kind of open up their own company and shy away from other things other than her own personality and individuality. So during this time when she created her own publishing company, she really opened up the platform for not only new writers, but for a lot of women too. She said that she did not like to publish things that were either already published or things that were already read before. She really wanted to emphasize new collections from new writers, and she really wanted people to hear the voice of women. I think that was her main thing. She wanted to create a platform for women.
Okay guys, this is McKaylee speaking. I'm going to talk to you guys about Jack Kerouac, who is also sometimes called the father of the Beat Generation, and one of the reasons why he's called the father of the Beat Generation is both because of his writing and his interactions with the other writers, but it's also because he actually coined the term the Beat Generation in On the Road, and when he said the quote, "They were like the men with the dungeon stone and gloom, rising from the underground, the sordid hipsters of America, a new Beat Generation." And that is actually where the term Beat Generation comes from. It's coined by him. So that's why he's sometimes called the father of the Beat Generation. And he has some common themes throughout his books that I investigated in On the Road, such as coming of age, importance of freedom in a capitalistic society, and the temporality of pretty much everything humankind holds dear. He also looks at how time has been corrupted by the capitalist society, and that is very important to him.
Common themes in the Beat Generation literature. As audiences read, these authors clearly paint portraits of a candid post-war United States in the 1940s through the 1960s. Consequently, glimpses of racism and sexism are seen throughout this generation's work. The authors often saw these wrongs and used their work to criticize. Many of the Beat Generation authors wrote on similar topics or explored similar themes throughout their lives. Some of the themes are intentional topics like drug and alcohol addiction, free lifestyles, sexuality, and sometimes morals. Many of the writers, like Ginsberg, would write about the United States and the issue that he saw in it. Diane di Prima was also an advocate for women's rights through her poetry. As readers experience the literature, themes of self-absorption and flawed characters also become very common themes as well. The Beat movement sought to write the world as it was, even the ugliness. During this era, many of the authors experimented with a technique called stream of consciousness. This technique allowed the writers to write as the words came to them. This was wildly different from the previous traditional ways of writing. Many authors like Jack Kerouac were able to write novels in the span of a few days. This technique was also used to break away from the norms of writing at the time. In combination with the lack of punctuation, the work from this sounds like thoughts inside the author's mind. Another major theme was sexuality. Many of the Beat movement authors were advocates for gay rights. Allen Ginsberg, for example, was openly gay, and his poetry reflected his beliefs.
Alright, so for the social issues and influences in the Beat generation, this includes a lot about expressive writing during this time. The members of the Beat generation really got into a more deep and dark writing. It was made very personal. It talked about depression, addiction. They really did not hide the way that their experiences in life. For example, William Burroughs, he talked a lot and he wrote a lot about his addiction and his marriage that wasn't doing so well. And it was very rare back then for people to even think about like being addicted to drugs, even though it was like a thing. People didn't openly talk about it, and the Beat generation really opened the conversation up to that thing, to that topic. This also encouraged new ideas, again, like talking about deep topics instead of just on the surface type of thing. It shied away from gender roles, this meaning men did show more emotion. They were more open and raw about their feelings. It was not very common that men would show emotion and cry about things, and it was seen more as a feminine trait. However, the people in the Beat generation really shied away from that. They did not, they wanted to make everything different. So being a part of this generation or this movement really meant showing emotion, shying away from gender roles. This also, I think it's really important for me to touch on the fact that a lot of the members of the Beat movement were homosexuals. So this was a big deal too, because no one was talking about it. This was still in the time where it was not a common thing to be or to even like express. I think women too, when they explore their sexuality, this is meaning having more than one sexual partner. It wasn't just date one guy, marry one guy, become a housewife. This was talking about really opening up the idea to kind of having more than one intimate partner. For example, Diane di Prima, she had multiple partners and did not hide it. She was very open about the whole thing, which caused her to be judged by many, but that was the whole point of this movement, that they didn't care. They wanted to change things and change expectations for both men and women. So during this time, the Cold War was going on. A lot of people rebelled against the government, which this was actually very rare for people to kind of stand up against the government, saying that the Cold War was a waste of time, a waste of money. The people of this movement actually, they did not like the fact that the government was involved in the Cold War, and they started an anti-war movement, and they said that they even went as far as to say that they were not Americans because they did not like the idea of starting a war with China and Russia during this time, like the space race and everything. So they were actually very against this.
Hey guys, McKaylee again. So I wanted to talk to you guys about why you should even care about the Beat Generation. Like, why are they important in today's world when this is something that happened, 60, 70 years ago? Like, why should we care? So, pretty much, they brought to light some very important questions about society and its many injustices. They were activists in the most important way. Like, they were very forthcoming about their own sexualities and their own beliefs, and they encouraged other people to do the same thing. They brought about social upheaval and change through writing, which is something that is kind of difficult to do. They were outspoken, but only through their writing. Well, not only through their writing, but majorly through their writing. So they set a precedent for future social movements, including the anti-war movement that was seen surrounding the Vietnam War, which is something that was going on during this time. They were actually a huge influencer in the hippie movement as well, which you can see pictured here. They introduced a new attitude towards different sexualities and freedom of expression. They encouraged people to really be their genuine selves and not care what other people thought. They actually even had an impact on modern music, because during that time, music started to kind of change and become more of a social commentary as well, and this was partially due to the Beat Generation, and I'll talk about that a little bit more on the next slide. But very much they set precedents for us, and they helped to change America into what it is today, and they were incredibly, incredibly important for that reason. So the Beat Generation still affects us today, and part of the reason why is because they brought about liberation of the world from censorship. They encouraged people to write what they want, to say what they want, to do what they want, and not and they encouraged people to not judge other people based off of these kinds of things. There was the decriminalization of some drugs, such as marijuana, which is, these guys, I'm not going to sugarcoat it, were very much into drugs and alcohol, and they were experimenting with drugs and alcohol, and they wanted everybody to be able to do pretty much what they wanted to do with their lives and, not have the interference of the law. They also had to do with the spread of ecological consciousness. They were activists not only in social causes but also in environmental causes, and they believed that the world needed to change, and they were there to try to help change it. As I mentioned a little bit before, they affected music. The evolution of rhythm and blues kind of was moving towards rock and roll at the time, and their writing was important in pushing it in that direction. They also encouraged respect for land and indigenous peoples and creatures. In On the Road, Jack Kerouac actually mentions that the world is an indigenous thing, to quote his book from On the Road. And they also, as I mentioned before, were very involved in anti-war movements. They were one of the major reasons, one of the major driving forces behind anti-war movements, and that is incredibly important to understand when you're thinking about the Beat Generation and how it affects us today. Thank you guys so much for watching our presentation about the Beat Generation. This was just to show you guys our images cited and our works cited, which is going to be real boring, so if you want to stop watching at this point, I don't blame you. Here's our first page, our second page, and then works cited, more works cited. There's like a lot of works cited because we used a lot of sources. And I will also be posting a link to this PowerPoint so that you guys can check this and look at these if you would like to. Also so that you can open the PowerPoint yourself. Anytime that you guys want to, if you need access to that, you'll have it.